Marcus didn't know that an ordinary night shift would turn into a test of survival. In a snowstorm, he rescued a girl from a burning car, but that was just the beginning. The next morning, there was a knock at his door. Subscribe and tell me where you're watching this video from. The wind howled through the narrow streets, carrying sharp, biting snowflakes that stung against the skin like tiny needles. The city, usually alive with the hum of traffic and the chatter of pedestrians, now lay buried under a thick blanket of snow. Only the distant sound of sirens and the occasional growl of a snowplow broke the eerie silence. Inside his small, dimly lit apartment, Marcus pulled his delivery uniform over his thermal sweater and checked his phone. The weather app confirmed what he already knew. A severe winter storm warning had been issued, urging residents to stay indoors unless absolutely necessary. Roads were treacherous, visibility was near zero, and the temperature was dropping fast. But Marcus had no choice. He zipped up his jacket and glanced at the stack of unpaid bills on the kitchen counter. Rent was due in a week, and his savings were barely enough to cover his basic expenses. College had always been his dream, but between working long shifts as a courier and scraping by to survive, higher education felt like a distant, unattainable goal. The job wasn't glamorous, but it kept him afloat. He had grown up in one of the rougher neighborhoods of the city, where opportunities were scarce and crime was abundant. Many of his childhood friends had fallen into dangerous paths, lured by the quick money that came with it. But Marcus had always believed in something better. He wasn't afraid of hard work, and if pushing through a brutal snowstorm meant keeping his dream alive, then so be it. His car was already covered in a thick layer of snow by the time he stepped outside. The freezing wind cut through his gloves as he brushed the ice from the windshield, his breath visible in the frigid air. The city's usual glow was muted by the swirling snow, reducing everything to a ghostly white blur. He started the engine, letting it warm up as he checked his delivery schedule. Most of the orders had already been canceled due to the weather, but one remained, a delivery to an upscale residential area on the outskirts of the city. The payout was decent, and the location wasn't too far from his apartment. If he could complete this one last trip, he'd be done for the night and could head home before the storm got any worse. Marcus navigated through the nearly deserted streets, his tires struggling for traction on the ice-slick roads. Street lights flickered under the weight of accumulating snow, and the city's usual vibrancy had been swallowed by the storm. It felt as if he were driving through an entirely different world, one where time had slowed and the streets had been abandoned to the relentless grip of winter. The residential district was a stark contrast to the part of town Marcus called home. Even under the storm's fury, the towering mansions and pristine, snow-covered driveways spoke of a wealth he had never known. He pulled up to the designated address, a modern, glass-fronted house that looked more like a luxury retreat than a residence. The warm glow of lights from inside suggested that someone was still awake, waiting for their order. After dropping off the package at the front door, he quickly made his way back to his car, eager to head home. But as he turned onto the main road leading out of the neighborhood, something caught his eye. A pair of headlights in the distance, moving far too fast for the icy conditions. The vehicle was a sleek, white convertible, the kind of car made for summer drives along the coast, not navigating through a deadly snowstorm. Marcus instinctively gripped the steering wheel tighter, watching in alarm as the car skidded on the frozen pavement, its tires losing all traction. Everything happened in a matter of seconds. The convertible spun wildly out of control, its rear end fishtailing before slamming violently into a metal guardrail. The impact sent it flipping onto its roof, the sickening crunch of metal echoing through the storm. The headlights flickered before going dark, leaving the wreckage barely visible beneath the swirling snow. Marcus's pulse pounded in his ears. Without hesitation, he slammed his foot on the brakes, his own car sliding slightly before coming to a stop. He threw open the door, the freezing wind instantly tearing at his face as he sprinted toward the overturned vehicle. Through the shattered windshield, he could make out the driver, a young woman, her blonde hair spilling over her face, motionless against the deployed airbag. Blood was smeared across her temple, and the way her body was positioned made it clear that she was trapped. Marcus yanked on the driver's side door, but it wouldn't budge. The impact had twisted the frame, pinning it shut. His breath came in rapid bursts as he tried again, putting all his strength into the effort, but the door refused to move. The acrid scent of gasoline filled the air. A new urgency gripped him as he realized the engine was still faintly humming, the front end of the car already beginning to smoke. If there was a fire, she wouldn't stand a chance. Marcus wiped the snow from his face, his mind racing. The passenger door was just as jammed, but the backseat window had shattered upon impact, leaving a small opening. It wasn't much, but it was something. He grabbed his jacket sleeve and wrapped it around his hand before punching out the remaining glass, clearing the edges to avoid cutting himself too deeply. With careful movements, he reached inside, struggling against the cramped space as he maneuvered his way toward the driver's seat. The woman's seatbelt was still fastened, keeping her slumped forward against the airbag. He had to work fast. Bracing himself against the frame, Marcus reached across her, fumbling with the buckle. It took a few tries, his fingers numb from the cold, but the belt finally clicked free. He gently tilted her back, making sure her head was supported. She stirred slightly, a soft, pained sound escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. Marcus couldn't waste another second. Positioning himself as best he could, he wrapped his arms around her and carefully pulled her through the back seat. She was lighter than he expected, but the awkward angle and his own exhaustion made it difficult. Snow pelted his face as he finally freed her from the wreck, cradling her against his chest as he stumbled back toward his car. Just as he reached the vehicle, a faint explosion erupted behind him. He turned in time to see flames licking up from the hood of the destroyed convertible, sending a rush of heat against the freezing air. His heart pounded as he pulled the passenger door open and gently laid the woman across the seat, making sure she was secure before shutting the door. His hands were shaking as he hurried to the driver's side, throwing himself behind the wheel and starting the engine. His phone was still dead. The storm raged harder, and the nearest hospital was miles away. Gritting his teeth, Marcus gripped the steering wheel and pressed down on the accelerator. There was no time to waste. The car's tires struggled against the thick layer of snow, skidding slightly as Marcus pressed the gas. The storm had worsened in just the past few minutes, transforming the road into an unpredictable sheet of ice. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, his headlights doing little against the swirling blizzard. Every muscle in his body was tense, his pulse hammering in his ears. The woman lay unconscious in the passenger seat, her head tilted slightly toward the window. She was breathing, but it was shallow and uneven. Blood from the wound on her temple had begun to seep into her blonde hair, staining it dark. Marcus knew she needed medical attention immediately, but the storm made the drive to the hospital a battle of its own. He glanced at his phone, still lifeless on the console. No way to call for help. He was on his own. Forcing himself to stay calm, he focused on the road ahead. The highway leading back toward the city was a white void, completely covered in fresh snow. His wipers worked furiously, but the ice forming along the edges of the windshield limited his view. He kept both hands firmly on the wheel, adjusting his grip every time the tires slid slightly on the unstable surface. Minutes passed, though they felt like hours. The snow pounded against the roof of the car, the wind howling like a living thing. His heater was running on full blast, but the cold still managed to seep into the vehicle. The woman stirred slightly, shifting her position with a weak moan. Marcus glanced at her, his mind racing. Who was she? What was she doing driving alone in a car like that, in weather like this? Her coat was expensive, made of a high-end material he could recognize but had never owned himself. The gold bracelet on her wrist caught the faint glow of the dashboard lights. Whoever she wasn't just anybody. A sudden jolt snapped him back to reality. The back tires lost traction for a split second, sending the car veering slightly to the side. He instinctively corrected, gripping the wheel tighter and forcing himself to breathe steadily. He couldn't afford to lose control, not now. Then, through the blizzard, the faint glow of streetlights appeared ahead. Civilization. Relief washed over him as he recognized the edge of the city. The snow-covered road signs confirmed that he was just a few miles from the hospital. The thought gave him renewed focus. He pressed down on the accelerator just slightly, pushing the car forward as quickly as he could without risking another skid. The woman let out another soft noise, barely a whisper. He risked another glance at her. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, but she remained unconscious. He couldn't tell if she was improving or getting worse. After another agonizing 10 minutes, the hospital finally came into view. The emergency entrance was lit up, a few figures visible through the storm as hospital staff braved the cold. Marcus didn't bother pulling into a proper parking space. He veered straight toward the emergency drop-off, slamming the brakes and throwing the car into park. Adrenaline pushed him forward as he yanked open the door and ran to the passenger side. Snow and wind blasted against him as he pulled the woman into his arms, carefully but urgently lifting her out of the car. The moment he stepped onto the pavement, he shouted for help. 2 nurses and a security guard rushed toward him with a stretcher. Their voices were barely audible over the storm, but Marcus caught enough to understand they were asking about what happened. "Car crash," he managed, his voice breathless from the cold and the weight of carrying her. "Lost control in the storm." They worked quickly, lifting her onto the stretcher and wheeling her inside. Marcus followed without hesitation, his boots tracking snow and slush across the pristine tile floor of the emergency room. The warmth of the building hit him immediately, contrasting sharply with the freezing air outside. Inside, doctors and nurses swarmed around the woman, checking her vitals and calling out medical jargon that Marcus didn't understand. He stood back, his hands still shaking, as he watched them wheel her down a hallway and disappear behind a set of double doors. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to take a breath. A nurse approached him, asking him questions, his name, what he had seen, how long ago the accident had happened. He answered as best as he could, though his thoughts were still scattered. His body was coming down from the rush of adrenaline, and exhaustion was beginning to creep in. He found a chair in the waiting area and sank into it, rubbing his face with his hands. His clothes were damp from the snow, his fingers still numb. The reality of the situation was finally settling in. He had saved someone's life tonight. The thought lingered in his mind, surreal and heavy. Outside, the storm raged on. The howling wind against the hospital windows made the waiting room feel strangely isolated, as if it existed in its own little world, untouched by the chaos beyond the glass. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered. A second later, everything went dark. The hospital plunged into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. Then came the confused murmurs of patients and visitors, the hurried footsteps of medical staff scrambling to react. Emergency backup lights flickered on along the hallways, but they were dim, barely illuminating the space. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, the exhaustion in his muscles replaced by a new wave of adrenaline. The power had gone out. That wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. He could hear the urgency in the voices around him. Nurses ran past, their faces lit only by the glow of phone flashlights. Doctors barked orders, trying to determine the extent of the situation. From somewhere deeper inside the hospital, someone called out in distress. Then, one of the nurses confirmed what he had feared. The backup generator hadn't activated. Marcus pushed himself up from the chair, his body tense. He wasn't an electrician, but he had worked with enough machinery to know that if the hospital's backup power wasn't coming on, there was a serious problem. A security guard rushed past him, speaking quickly into his radio. Marcus caught snippets of his words. Something about checking the generator room. His gaze flicked toward the hallway where they had taken the woman he had rescued. The doors remained closed, but he knew that inside, doctors were still treating her. If this power outage lasted too long, her survival, along with that of many others in critical condition, could be at risk. The thought propelled him forward. He reached out and stopped the security guard. "Where's the generator room?" he asked. The guard hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibilities and the urgency of the moment. But one look at Marcus's determined expression and the chaos around them made him nod. "Follow me." They moved quickly through the hospital's darkened corridors, stepping past nurses struggling to assist patients with only phone flashlights to guide them. Some of the emergency machines had backup batteries, but they wouldn't last long. The situation was getting worse by the second. As they reached the lower level, the air grew colder, the distant noise of the storm outside more pronounced. The security guard swiped his keycard at a heavy metal door, pushing it open. The generator room was dimly lit by the emergency strips along the ceiling. Marcus immediately noticed the problem. Her eyelids fluttered slightly, but she remained unconscious. He couldn't tell if she was improving or getting worse. After another agonizing 10 minutes, the hospital finally came into view. The emergency entrance was lit up, a few figures visible through the storm as hospital staff braved the cold. Marcus didn't bother pulling into a proper parking space. He veered straight toward the emergency drop-off, slamming the brakes and throwing the car into park. Adrenaline pushed him forward as he yanked open the door and ran to the passenger side. Snow and wind blasted against him as he pulled the woman into his arms, carefully but urgently lifting her out of the car. The moment he stepped onto the pavement, he shouted for help. 2 nurses and a security guard rushed toward him with a stretcher. Their voices were barely audible over the storm, but Marcus caught enough to understand they were asking about what happened. "Car crash," he managed, his voice breathless from the cold and the weight of carrying her. "Lost control in the storm." They worked quickly, lifting her onto the stretcher and wheeling her inside. Marcus followed without hesitation, his boots tracking snow and slush across the pristine tile floor of the emergency room. The warmth of the building hit him immediately, contrasting sharply with the freezing air outside. Inside, doctors and nurses swarmed around the woman, checking her vitals and calling out medical jargon that Marcus didn't understand. He stood back, his hands still shaking, as he watched them wheel her down a hallway and disappear behind a set of double doors. For the first time since the accident, he allowed himself to take a breath. A nurse approached him, asking him questions: his name, what he had seen, how long ago the accident had happened. He answered as best as he could, though his thoughts were still scattered. His body was coming down from the rush of adrenaline, and exhaustion was beginning to creep in. He found a chair in the waiting area and sank into it, rubbing his face with his hands. His clothes were damp from the snow, his fingers still numb. The reality of the situation was finally settling in. He had saved someone's life tonight. The thought lingered in his mind, surreal and heavy. Outside, the storm raged on. The howling wind against the hospital windows made the waiting room feel strangely isolated, as if it existed in its own little world, untouched by the chaos beyond the glass. Then, suddenly, the lights flickered. A second later, everything went dark. The hospital plunged into darkness. For a moment, the only sound was the wind howling outside, rattling the windows. Then came the confused murmurs of patients and visitors, the hurried footsteps of medical staff scrambling to react. Emergency backup lights flickered on along the hallways, but they were dim, barely illuminating the space. Marcus sat frozen in his chair, the exhaustion in his muscles replaced by a new wave of adrenaline. The power had gone out. That wasn't just an inconvenience, it was a crisis. He could hear the urgency in the voices around him. Nurses ran past, their faces lit only by the glow of phone flashlights. Doctors barked orders, trying to determine the extent of the situation. From somewhere deeper inside the hospital, someone called out in distress. Then, one of the nurses confirmed what he had feared. The backup generator hadn't activated. Marcus pushed himself up from the chair, his body tense. He wasn't an electrician, but he had worked with enough machinery to know that if the hospital's backup power wasn't coming on, there was a serious problem. A security guard rushed past him, speaking quickly into his radio. Marcus caught snippets of his words. Something about checking the generator room. His gaze flicked toward the hallway where they had taken the woman he had rescued. The doors remained closed, but he knew that inside, doctors were still treating her. If this power outage lasted too long, her survival, along with that of many others in critical condition, could be at risk. The thought propelled him forward. He reached out and stopped the security guard. "Where's the generator room?" he asked. The guard hesitated, clearly torn between his responsibilities and the urgency of the moment. But one look at Marcus's determined expression and the chaos around them made him nod. "Follow me." They moved quickly through the hospital's darkened corridors, stepping past nurses struggling to assist patients with only phone flashlights to guide them. Some of the emergency machines had backup batteries, but they wouldn't last long. The situation was getting worse by the second. As they reached the lower level, the air grew colder, the distant noise of the storm outside more pronounced. The security guard swiped his keycard at a heavy metal door, pushing it open. The generator room was dimly lit by the emergency strips along the ceiling. Marcus immediately noticed the problem. The doctor hesitated. "She's still unconscious. We're monitoring her condition closely. It was a serious concussion, and there's some concern about her neck injury, but she's out of immediate danger." Marcus nodded, his pulse finally beginning to slow. He wanted to press for more details. wanted to know who she was, if her family had been contacted, but he also knew that he had done all he could for now. "Sit down," the doctor added, gesturing toward one of the plastic chairs against the wall. "You look like you're about to drop." Marcus hadn't realized how exhausted he was until he actually allowed himself to stop moving. His limbs felt sluggish, his fingers numb from the combination of cold and stress. He sank into the chair, rubbing his hands together for warmth as the doctor walked away to tend to other patients. Now that the immediate crisis had passed, the weight of the night truly settled onto his shoulders. The accident, the desperate drive through the blizzard, the moment the hospital plunged into darkness, every moment had been a battle against time, against the elements, against fate itself. And yet, somehow he had made it through. Marcus let out a slow breath, resting his elbows on his knees as he stared at the hospital floor. He should probably leave. His job was done. He had no real reason to stay, but something kept him there. His phone was still dead. He had no way of calling a ride, no way of checking in with work to explain why he had gone AWOL for the last few hours. But more than that, he felt an unshakable pull to stay, at least until he knew more. He glanced up at the reception desk. A thought crossed his mind. A charger. If he could just get his phone powered back on, he could figure out his next steps. Pushing himself to his feet, he approached the reception area where a nurse was organizing paperwork. "Hey," he said, voice still rough. "Do you guys have a phone charger I could borrow?" The nurse looked up, taking in his disheveled appearance. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes. People had obviously started talking about the guy who had brought in the crash victim and fixed the hospital's generator in the same night. "Yeah, hang on," she said, reaching into a drawer and pulling out a universal charging cable. She handed it to him, and he muttered a quiet thanks before finding an open outlet near the waiting area. He plugged in his phone and waited, rubbing his hands over his face. His body was starting to shake slightly, the combined effects of the cold, stress, and exhaustion finally catching up to him. The moment his phone screen flickered to life, he let out a relieved breath. The battery was at 2%, but it was enough to make a call. He scrolled through his contacts, hesitating for a moment before pressing the call button. The phone rang twice before a voice answered. "This is the Mirror Spa Hotel. How can I assist you?" Marcus straightened slightly. "This is Marcus, the guy who does deliveries. There was a car accident on the mountain road tonight. A woman in a white convertible. She's at the hospital now. I don't know if she's one of your guests, but if she is, her family might be looking for her." There was a brief pause on the other end. Then the receptionist's tone shifted, becoming more serious. "Can you describe her?" Marcus closed his eyes, recalling the details as best he could. Blonde hair, fair skin. She was wearing a red scarf. Her car was a luxury model, completely totaled in the crash. There was another pause. "Understood," the receptionist said. "We'll look into it right away. Thank you for letting us know." The call ended, leaving Marcus staring at the now 3% battery icon on his screen. He leaned back in his chair, exhaling slowly. It was out of his hands now. If the woman had family or someone waiting for her, they'd be here soon. All he could do now was wait. Minutes passed, then an hour. The hospital remained busy, but the tension had eased. The storm outside still raged, but inside, things were beginning to return to normal. Then, the doors to the emergency ward burst open. A man in his 50s, dressed in an expensive coat, strode inside, his expression tense and anxious. He made a beeline for the reception desk, his voice barely controlled as he spoke. "I'm the father of the girl who was in the accident," he said. "Where is she? Is she okay?" Marcus sat up slightly, watching the scene unfold. The receptionist spoke quickly, reassuring the man that his daughter was stable. A doctor emerged from the hallway, exchanging quiet words with him before leading him deeper into the hospital. Marcus let out a slow breath. It was strange, watching someone else take over the responsibility that had consumed his entire night. For hours, this girl's life had been in his hands. Now, she was back with the people who belonged to her world, the world of wealth and privilege, the world he had never been part of. He could leave now. And yet, he didn't move. He wasn't sure why. Maybe it was exhaustion, or maybe it was the lingering weight of the night's events pressing down on him. But something told him this wasn't over yet. Marcus remained seated in the waiting area, his body heavy with exhaustion, yet his mind refused to settle. The storm outside continued to howl against the hospital windows, the thick snow piling up against the glass. It was surreal, the contrast between the chaos of the night and the quiet hum of medical machines now that power had been restored. He could have left. The girl's father was here now, speaking with the doctors, and whatever happened next was no longer Marcus's responsibility. But something anchored him to the spot. Maybe it was the adrenaline still burning in his veins, or maybe it was the simple fact that, for the first time in his life, he had done something that genuinely mattered. He rubbed a hand over his face, trying to chase away the fatigue setting into his bones. The events of the past few hours played in his mind like scenes from a movie. The wreck, the fire, the drive through the blizzard, the moment the hospital plunged into darkness. If he hadn't been here tonight, how different would things have turned out? He had saved a life, and he had kept this hospital from falling into complete catastrophe. A movement in the hallway pulled him from his thoughts. The girl's father, who the staff had referred to as Mr. Murray, was standing just outside one of the emergency rooms, speaking in hushed tones with a nurse. His hands were stuffed into the pockets of his expensive coat, his posture stiff with anxiety. Marcus had no intention of approaching him. He had done his part, and he wasn't expecting any kind of reward or gratitude. But just as he was about to force himself to stand and head for the exit, Mr. Murray turned his head slightly, and their eyes met. The man hesitated, as if recognizing him, and then took a step forward. "You're the one who saved my daughter," he said, his voice low but steady. Marcus shifted awkwardly in his seat. "I just happened to be there," he said, shrugging. "I couldn't just leave her." The older man studied him for a long moment. There was something unreadable in his expression, not quite skepticism, but not immediate warmth either. "The doctors told me you also got the hospital's power back online," he added, "that without you, things could have gone much worse." Marcus exhaled, rubbing the back of his neck. "I knew a little about fixing things," he admitted. "Did what I could." Mr. Murray nodded slowly, glancing down the hall toward the room where his daughter was still unconscious. "You saved her life," he said at last. "Twice, from what I understand." Marcus didn't know how to respond to that. He hadn't done it for recognition. He had done it because in those moments there had been no other choice. "Thank you," Mr. Murray said, his voice quieter now. "I don't even know how to begin repaying you." Marcus shook his head. "You don't have to." But the man didn't seem convinced. There was another pause, thick with unsaid words, and then Mr. Murray reached into his coat pocket and pulled out an envelope. Marcus's stomach twisted slightly. He already knew what it was before the man even spoke. "This is just a small token of my gratitude," Mr. Murray said, extending it toward him. Marcus stared at it, something bitter rising in his chest. It was money, a reward, a way for the wealthy to settle their debts and move on. He hesitated, his pride warring with exhaustion. A part of him wanted to refuse, to say that he hadn't done any of this for money, but another part of him, the part that had spent years struggling to make ends meet, the part that had worked double shifts just to keep his head above water, knew that turning it down would be foolish. He reached out and took the envelope, but he didn't open it. Mr. Murray gave a small nod. "I'll be in touch," he said. "I want to do more for you than just this." Marcus wasn't sure what to say to that, so he simply nodded in return. The conversation ended there. Mr. Murray turned and walked back down the hall toward his daughter's room, disappearing behind the door. Marcus sat there for a long moment, staring down at the envelope in his hands. Eventually, he exhaled and slipped it into his pocket, pushing himself to his feet. It was time to go home. The drive back was just as treacherous as before. The blizzard had not let up, and the roads were even worse than when he had first set out. Snow blanketed the streets, making every turn a gamble. But this time, there was no urgency, no life hanging in the balance. For the first time that night, Marcus allowed himself to feel the weight of exhaustion settle over him. His body ached from the tension of the evening, his hands sore from gripping the wheel too tightly for too long. By the time he pulled up in front of his small apartment complex, his limbs felt heavy, his thoughts sluggish. He barely had the energy to kick the snow off his boots before stumbling inside. The apartment was cold and dimly lit, the only sound the faint hum of the heater struggling to fight against the chill. He peeled off his wet jacket, tossing it over the back of a chair, and collapsed onto the couch without even bothering to change out of his work clothes. He should have felt something. Relief, pride, maybe even a little disbelief at everything that had happened, but in that moment, all he felt was exhaustion. Sleep took him before he could even process anything else. The next morning, the world outside was still buried under a thick layer of snow, but the storm had finally passed. Sunlight filtered through his window, casting pale shadows across the floor. For a few seconds, Marcus just lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to convince himself that the events of the previous night hadn't just been some bizarre dream. Then, his phone buzzed. Groaning, he sat up and reached for it. His battery was low, but the message on the screen was clear. Unknown. Number: call me when you're awake. Matt Murray. Marcus frowned, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. It took him a second to remember. Mr. Murray, the father of the woman he had saved. His gaze flickered to the coat he had tossed over the chair. He reached into the pocket and pulled out the envelope. He hadn't checked it the night before. Curiosity and apprehension warred in his chest as he slowly unfolded it. And then he froze. The number on the check was staggering, more than anything he had ever seen in his life. His heart pounded as he stared at it, his mind struggling to process what this meant. This wasn't just a thank you. This was life-changing. A lump formed in his throat. He had spent his whole life scraping by, barely making ends meet, constantly putting his dreams on hold because survival came first. And now, with one signature, everything had shifted. His phone buzzed again, pulling him from his thoughts. Another message. Matt Murray. I meant what I said. I want to help you. Marcus exhaled slowly. This was more than he had ever expected, and for the first time in a long time, he allowed himself to consider something he had long since pushed aside. Maybe, just maybe, things were finally about to change. Marcus sat motionless on the edge of his couch, the weight of the check in his hands feeling heavier than paper should ever be. His fingers ran over the crisp edges of the envelope, his pulse a steady drumbeat in his ears. He had spent his whole life making ends meet, stretching every paycheck, skipping meals when necessary, and now, just like that, he was holding a sum of money that could change everything. His phone screen flickered with the last message from Matt Murray, the father of the woman he had saved. "I meant what I said. I want to help you." The words lingered in his mind. It wasn't just the money, it was the offer of something more, an opportunity. But was it real? Was this some rich man's guilt-driven act of generosity, a way to settle his conscience before moving on with his life? Or was there actually something genuine behind the offer? Marcus let out a slow breath, staring at the ceiling. A part of him wanted to reject it outright. He had never been the type to take handouts, and the idea of being indebted to a wealthy stranger made his stomach twist. But the truth was undeniable. This was a chance. A real chance to break out of the cycle he had been trapped in. A chance to go to school, to pursue the engineering degree he had dreamed of for years, to build something lasting instead of just surviving from one paycheck to the next. His fingers hovered over the phone screen for a moment before he finally tapped the call button. The line rang twice before a voice picked up. "Marcus." Matt Murray's tone was calm, steady, almost as if he had expected the call. Marcus hesitated for only a second before speaking. "You said you wanted to help me." A pause. "I did." There was something in his voice, an unwavering sincerity that caught Marcus off guard. He had expected formality, or maybe even distance, but there was none of that. "I'd like to meet with you," Matt continued, "in person, if you're willing." Marcus exhaled, glancing toward the window where the remnants of last night's storm still blanketed the world in white. "All right," he said. "Where?" 15 minutes later, Marcus found himself standing outside a sleek black sedan, the snow crunching beneath his boots. The address Matt had sent him led to a quiet street just a few blocks from the hospital. The car was warm when he climbed inside, and Matt was already waiting for him in the back seat, dressed in an impeccably tailored suit that made Marcus feel painfully underdressed in his worn-out hoodie and jeans. The older man studied him for a moment, as if assessing him before speaking. "I meant what I said last night," Matt told him, "and I want to explain why." Marcus nodded, waiting. Matt leaned back slightly, his expression thoughtful. "My daughter, Carrie, is my only child. She was on her way to meet me at the hotel when the accident happened." His voice tightened slightly, the controlled exterior faltering just for a second. "If you hadn't been there, I don't even want to think about what could have happened." Marcus swallowed, unsure of how to respond. "I don't throw money at problems to make them go away," Matt continued, his tone sharpening slightly, "and I don't believe in rewarding people just to ease my own guilt. But I do believe in helping those who deserve it." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I'm not looking for a reward," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. Matt nodded. "I know. That's why I'm offering you something else." There was a brief pause before he reached into his coat pocket and pulled out a small folder. He passed it to Marcus, who hesitated before flipping it open. Inside were official documents, enrollment forms, financial aid applications, and a detailed summary of a fully paid college tuition program. Marcus's breath caught. "This isn't charity," Matt said, watching his reaction closely. "This is an investment. You told the doctors last night that you knew how to fix the generator because you've worked with machines before. You have a talent, Marcus, one that shouldn't go to waste. Marcus's hands tightened slightly around the folder. "I want to help you get your engineering degree," Matt continued. "No strings attached, no expectations, just an opportunity." Marcus was silent for a long moment, his mind racing. He thought about his life, about every time he had put off his dreams because rent was due, because food was more important, because survival had always come first. He thought about the long hours spent working dead-end jobs, about the exhaustion that never seemed to fade, about the moments when he had allowed himself to hope, only to remind himself that people like him didn't get second chances. And yet, here one was, staring him right in the face. His chest tightened, emotions he couldn't quite name rising too fast to contain. Finally, he looked up at Matt, his throat dry. "Why me?" Matt's lips pressed together in a small, knowing smile. "Because I believe in repaying debts that truly matter," he said, "and because the world needs more people like you." The words landed harder than Marcus expected. For the first time in his life, someone was looking at him not as a statistic, not as another struggling kid from the wrong side of the city, but as someone with value, someone who mattered. He looked down at the folder again, then back up at Matt. His fingers tightened around the pages. And this time, he didn't say no. The following week moved in a blur. Marcus filled out the forms, met with school advisors, and by the end of it all, he had an official letter of enrollment. He stood outside the university's entrance, the campus covered in fresh snow, and for the first time in years he felt something he hadn't allowed himself to feel in a long time. Hope. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. He still had to prove himself, to work hard, to earn every step forward. But for once, he wasn't alone. And as he walked through the gates toward a future that had once seemed impossible, he knew one thing for certain. Everything had changed. And this was just the beginning. For the first time in years, Marcus felt like he was walking on solid ground. The weight that had always clung to him, the constant anxiety over rent, the endless cycle of paycheck-to-paycheck living, felt a little lighter now. It hadn't vanished, not completely, but for the first time there was something beyond just surviving. There was a future that had seemed impossible just a week ago. He had spent the last few days in a strange state of limbo, filling out paperwork, meeting with academic advisors, touring the university that was suddenly within reach. It was surreal. Every time he looked at his enrollment confirmation, he half expected someone to tell him there had been a mistake. But there was no mistake. Matt Murray had been serious about his offer, and now Marcus was officially a student. It still didn't feel real. He had spent so long telling himself that college wasn't an option that now, standing on the edge of something new, he didn't quite know how to process it. But there was still one thing left to do. Marcus had taken the check Matt had given him and put it in a drawer the moment he got home. He hadn't touched it, hadn't even looked at the number since that first morning when the sheer size of it had knocked the breath out of him. Now, sitting on the edge of his couch, he pulled it out again. His fingers traced over the paper. The sum was still just as staggering as it had been the first time. This money could change everything. It wasn't just enough for school, it was enough to start fresh, to move out of the cramped apartment he had been stuck in for years, to finally stop worrying about how he would get through each month. And yet, something about it didn't sit right. It felt like too much. Yes, he had saved Matt's daughter. Yes, he had helped fix the hospital's generator, but he hadn't done any of it expecting a reward. He had done it because in that moment there had been no other choice. This wasn't supposed to be about money. He exhaled, running a hand through his hair before reaching for his phone. The call rang twice before Matt picked up. "Marcus," the older man greeted, his voice calm as always. Marcus hesitated for only a second before speaking. "I can't accept this." There was a pause. "I thought you might say that," Matt said finally, his tone unreadable. "It's too much," Marcus admitted. "I didn't do any of this for money, and I can't take something like this." Matt was quiet for a long moment. "You know," he said finally, "I've met a lot of people in my life, people who would have taken that check without a second thought, people who would have seen it as an easy way out, but not you." Marcus swallowed. "I respect that," Matt continued, "and if you truly don't want the money, I won't push it on you." Relief flooded through Marcus's chest. "But," Matt added, "I do want you to consider something else." Marcus frowned slightly. "What?" "You've already accepted the tuition offer," Matt said. "That's an investment in your future. But what about now? What about everything else?" Marcus glanced around his apartment. The peeling paint on the walls, the old couch that had seen better days, the draft coming in from the poorly sealed windows. "Use it for something that matters," Matt said. "Use it to give yourself the space to focus on school, to breathe a little easier. You don't owe me anything, Marcus. I just want to see you succeed." Marcus exhaled slowly. He had spent so long fighting for every scrap, so long living on the edge of financial ruin, that the idea of having a safety net was almost too much to process. But maybe, just maybe, Matt was right. Maybe it wasn't about accepting a handout. Maybe it was about giving himself permission to step forward. "All right," Marcus said finally. "I'll think about it." Matt chuckled. "That's all I ask." The following week, Marcus found himself standing in front of a place he had never expected to be, a realtor's office. It had taken him days to convince himself to even entertain the idea. But the more he thought about it, the more he realized that staying in his current apartment, staying in the same cycle he had been in for years, wasn't the right move. If he was going to build something new, he needed a fresh start. The realtor, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and a friendly smile, listened patiently as he explained what he was looking for. "Something close to campus," he said. "Small, nothing fancy, just stable." She nodded, flipping through a few listings on her screen. "I think I have a few options that might work for you." By the end of the day, Marcus had found it. A small house, just a short walk from campus. It wasn't anything extravagant, but it was warm, quiet, and most importantly, it was his. Signing the papers felt like stepping into an entirely different life, a better life. For the first time, he wasn't just surviving, he was moving forward, and it felt damn good. The day Marcus moved in, the first person he called was Matt. "I wanted to say thank you," he said simply. Matt chuckled. "I had a feeling you'd figure it out." Marcus smiled, looking around his new home. The space was still mostly empty, just a few pieces of furniture, a mattress on the floor, and a small desk where he had already started stacking his textbooks. But it didn't matter, because this was just the beginning. "You know," Matt said after a moment, "I told you before, I believe in repaying debts that truly matter." Marcus nodded, even though the other man couldn't see it. "Well," Matt continued, his tone lighter now, "consider yours officially repaid." Marcus exhaled, a slow, steady breath that felt like letting go of years of struggle. "Thank you," he said again. This time he meant it in a way that went beyond words, because this wasn't just about money. It was about something much bigger. A chance. A future. And for the first time in his life, Marcus wasn't afraid to reach for it. The first morning in his new home felt like stepping into a different life. Marcus sat at the small kitchen table, a steaming cup of coffee warming his hands. Sunlight filtered through the window, casting soft golden hues across the modest space. It was quiet, comfortably so. No neighbors arguing through thin apartment walls, no honking from cars packed into crowded city streets, just the faint rustle of wind against the glass, the occasional creak of the floorboards as the house settled. For the first time in as long as he could remember, Marcus felt at peace. It was still surreal. Less than 2 weeks ago, he had been bracing himself for another long winter of scraping by, delivering packages in the snow, wondering if he'd ever escape the endless cycle of just trying to survive. And now, here he was, enrolled in college, living in a home that actually belonged to him. It wasn't a mansion, and it sure as hell wasn't luxury, but it was his. He took a slow sip of coffee, letting the warmth seep into his bones. He had a lot ahead of him. Classes started next week, and though he was excited, there was an underlying current of nervousness, too. He had spent years working, using his hands, solving problems on the spot, pushing through exhaustion. School was going to be different. He hadn't written an essay in years. He hadn't sat in a classroom since high school. Would he even know how to study? Would he be able to keep up with students who had been preparing for this their whole lives? Doubt tried to creep in, but he pushed it aside. He had gotten this far. He wasn't going to turn back now. As he finished his coffee, his phone buzzed on the table. He glanced at the screen, a faint smirk pulling at his lips when he saw the name. Matt Murray. He picked up. "Didn't expect to hear from you this early," Marcus said. Matt chuckled on the other end. "Just checking in, wanted to make sure you didn't wake up thinking all of this was a dream." Marcus exhaled, glancing around his new place. "Still kinda feels like one." "Good," Matt said. "Means you're doing something right." There was a brief pause, then his tone shifted. "I also wanted to let you know, Carrie's awake." Marcus sat up straighter. "She is?" "Yeah, came to last night. She's still a little out of it, but she's asking questions. The first thing she wanted to know was who pulled her out of the wreck." Marcus hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck. "Did you tell her?" Matt let out a quiet laugh. "Oh, I told her. And now she wants to meet you." Marcus blinked. That wasn't what he had expected. "She's still recovering, but when she's feeling up for it, I'd like you to come by," Matt continued. "No pressure. Just thought you should know." Marcus leaned back in his chair, staring at the ceiling for a long moment before nodding. Yeah, okay. Let me know when." After hanging up, he sat there for a while, processing everything. It made sense, he supposed. If he had almost died and someone had pulled him from the wreckage, he'd want to meet them too. Still, the idea made him feel exposed. He had saved her because it was the right thing to do, not because he wanted thanks. But maybe this was part of the whole new path thing, stepping outside his comfort zone, facing things instead of walking away. And so, when Matt texted him later that day with a time to visit, Marcus didn't hesitate. The hospital felt different this time. Last time, it had been chaos. Storm, fire, power outage. This time the halls were quiet, filled with the steady beeping of machines and the soft murmur of conversations. Matt met him in the hallway outside Carrie's room. "She's still a little weak," he warned, "but she's stubborn like her mother was. If she wants to talk to you, I'm not stopping her." Marcus nodded, following Matt inside. Carrie was sitting up in bed, propped against a mountain of pillows. The bruises on her face had faded slightly, but there was still a thin line of stitches on her forehead. Her blonde hair was pulled back, and when her eyes landed on Marcus, they were sharp, curious, calculating. "So," she said, her voice a little rough but steady, "you're the guy who saved my life." Marcus shifted uncomfortably. "I guess." Carrie studied him for a long moment before shaking her head. "I don't even remember the crash. Last thing I remember is driving toward the hotel and then nothing. But my dad told me everything." Marcus didn't know what to say to that, so he just nodded. Carrie's gaze flickered to her father before settling back on Marcus. "You didn't have to stop," she said quietly. "Most people wouldn't have." Marcus shrugged. Didn't feel like a choice. Something passed through her expression, something Marcus couldn't quite read. "Well," she said, voice softer now, "thank you." Marcus shifted, suddenly feeling like he was intruding. "I'm just glad you're okay." Carrie smiled slightly. "Me too." Matt cleared his throat. "All right, I think that's enough for now. She needs to rest." Marcus took that as his cue to leave. As he turned towards the door, Carrie's voice stopped him. "Hey, Marcus?" He glanced back. She tilted her head slightly, still studying him like he was a puzzle she hadn't quite figured out. "I hope I see you again." Marcus didn't quite know what to say to that, so he just nodded, giving a small wave before stepping out into the hallway. By the time he got back to his house, the sun was starting to set. The air was crisp, the sky streaked with orange and purple. Marcus leaned against the hood of his car, letting himself take it all in. Everything had changed, not just his circumstances, but him. For so long, he had been stuck in survival mode, always looking at the next shift, the next bill, the next struggle. But now, for the first time, the future wasn't just something to worry about. It was something to look forward to. He had school, a home, a second chance. And for the first time in a long time, Marcus wasn't just existing, he was living. As he stood there, watching the last light of day fade beyond the horizon, he realized something. This wasn't the end of his story. It was only the beginning. If you enjoyed this story, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next one. Check out our other videos for more incredible stories. And if this one moved you, share it with someone who might need to hear it.